This morning we'll wrap up our discussion of the lessons Jesus has to teach us, specifically through the medium of parables, which are so central to Luke's gospel. Today we'll be looking at a slightly less familiar parable than the ones we have been considering, and it's one of the last parables Luke records in his gospel. But it teaches a lesson that is certainly as important as any other we will find about the role of God's grace in our salvation. So hold that thought while we look at today's passage from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. It's a parable that is typically referred to as the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. So hear the word of the Lord. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. May God bless the reading of this holy word. What a wonderful parable this is, that offers some of the most important teaching we'll find anywhere about God's grace, and our need to accept God's grace with faith and thanksgiving. But if we want to get to the heart of this passage and the message here, we have to overcome some significant challenges. The challenges for the people of the day to whom Jesus was speaking would have been that, well, there were plenty of people who would have heard this parable, this story, and their response to it would have been to have said, okay, so what? Because while we may be struck today by the inappropriate, and I do mean inappropriate manner, in which this Pharisee seems to pray with such self-righteousness and to look down judgmentally on the tax collector in the parable, the people of the day would have not necessarily seen anything amiss in the way this parable portrays Pharisees. I mean, they had much the same opinion of Pharisees that this particular Pharisee had of himself. They looked at Pharisees and they thought that Pharisees were righteous, at least as many defined righteousness back then. They were trying diligently to live what they thought of as godly kinds of life. And so the Pharisees began as a group of individuals who were concerned about how far Israel had drifted from its original position as a people who enjoyed that special covenantal relationship with God. Some believe this was why God had not yet saved Israel from its oppression by foreign powers. And if you read the Old Testament prophets, it's easy to understand why they felt this way. I mean, it's a common theme throughout the Old Testament, the minor prophets and the major prophets, that God either is currently or God is about to punish Israel for the way they've become just like all those other countries around them. And so, as a result of this, the Pharisees have committed themselves to doing better. The Pharisees have made a renewed commitment to adhere rigorously to the Old Testament law. And they're going to do it even to the extent that they intend to be different than, or even set apart from, everyone else around them. And this is where the word Pharisee actually comes from, to separate, or to be separated, or separate. Now, on the surface, you have to admit, this doesn't seem like a horrible thing, does it? Sounds like a bit of a noble endeavor, don't you think? We're going to really try hard to obey God's law. And the problem is that this strict adherence to legalism and this separateness from other people actually led to a couple of problems over time. First, it led to an extreme sense of self-righteousness among the Pharisees. This was on full display in today's parable. But the Pharisee was proud that he not only kept the law, but in many cases, he exceeded what was expected by the law, particularly as it related to practices like praying in the temple, fasting, giving tithes, giving alms to the needy. The second problem with the Pharisee was this sense within that group that being separate, avoiding contact with unclean things or people, was another step toward their pursuit of extreme righteousness. Well, that led them to avoid contact with those that were not as committed to righteousness as they were. And certainly they avoided contact with anyone who might have been considered a sinner. And we see this throughout the Gospels. But the problem was this led to a comparison of their own righteousness with the apparent unrighteousness of others, like those listed in the parable. Extortioners, adulterers, or tax collectors. And this comparison just added to their sense of self-righteousness and of being better than the others around them. When you understand these attitudes, you see that a prayer like the one Jesus tells us was prayed by the Pharisee, and even the Pharisee's opinion of that poor tax collector might not seem so very outrageous after all. And this would have been a challenge for those listening to Jesus back then to get beyond if they were going to understand the real, true, deeper message that Jesus had for them here. Now, the challenge for us, well, it's a little different, but ultimately it's similar, if not the same. Because we all have our own biases ourselves in the way we feel about and act toward the people around us. I'm certainly no exception. And I'm not proud to say that I'd be lying if I told you that I have not formed a first impression of others based on my own personal biases or perhaps on their appearance in some way. In my previous career as a banker, I made probably thousands of loans to individuals and businesses, and I'm positive there were times when my decision was influenced both positively and negatively in some way by outward appearances and how I felt about the person or the business in front of me. I still remember one instance. I don't guess I'll ever forget this. Early in my career, I was just starting out as the new assistant branch manager at the Macon Road branch of CB&T. It's right down the street, that red brick building in front of where Kmart used to be. I was sitting in the office of the branch manager, and we were going over a list of our top loan and deposit customers, so I would know who I needed to go call on and visit as a part of my job duties. Suddenly, as we were going through the list, he pointed over my shoulder and he said, there's one of our best customers right there. I turned around, I looked into the branch, which was relatively empty, and all I saw was this fellow with this kind of scraggly beard down to about here, wearing stained overalls and worn out work boots. And this was way before the era of Duck Dynasty, by the way. I certainly didn't see anyone who looked to me like I expected one of our best customers to look. That is, unless you knew that this same fella, all the way back in 1986, by the way, kept over $1 million on deposit with the bank and had a personal net worth of over $10 million. And that day I relearned an important message that my parents had taught me and that society continues to teach us these days about it being wrong to what? Judge a book by its cover. Of course, we all know this. We know that our culture frowns on overt self-righteousness and arrogance toward others. And so we read this passage today and we say, well, of course it's wrong to be arrogant toward others like the Pharisee was here. And this is, of course, a very important lesson for us to glean from this message and from this parable. But if we aren't careful, we might settle for reading this parable and getting only that message about not being self-righteous and not looking down on other people with arrogance and with judgment. But I'm here to tell you, the message Jesus had back then was deeper for those people 2,000 years ago, and it is a deeper message for us sitting here today and reading this parable. Because while we might not ever pray a prayer like that Pharisee, while we might not ever be as overtly self-righteous or judgmental of others like that Pharisee, if we are honest with ourselves, we can't help but look in the mirror from time to time and ask the question, is that a Pharisee I see? Because these same mindsets, these same attitudes exist right here today, and they pose a much greater threat to us than simply causing us to be viewed or seen as people who are rude or arrogant. And Jesus knew we would struggle with this, and so he gave us this parable as a warning, but also as a message of hope. Now look again at how the passage begins. It says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, to say they were self-righteous. The gospel writer tells us right up front, this parable from Jesus is not for the righteous, not for the truly righteous, or for those looking to God for help with being righteous. No, this message is for those who trust in themselves for their righteousness, for people who are convinced that their innate goodness, their hard work, their commitment to doing good deeds has succeeded in making them truly righteous in the eyes of God. And as we've seen already established, this certainly applied to the Pharisees. They became experts in the law. They engaged in external acts of piety. They were faithful in tithing and fasting and praying. They did everything they could to earn God's favor and God's approval. And they looked around themselves and they saw others engaged in all types of unsavory activities. And when they saw that others didn't match the piety and the commitment to following God's law, didn't match the kind of lives the Pharisees lived, it convinced them that they had found favor with God, that they were doing what it took to earn justification in the eyes of God. And that's all fine except for one thing. It misses the whole point of what Jesus came to teach. And frankly, it misses the point of what the Bible has to teach us. That first, we can't work or earn our way into God's favor. We just can't do it. We can never be good enough to please God. And that's what Paul is telling us when he writes in Romans chapter 3. You know the passage? None is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. See, God's law shows us just how hopeless and fruitless it is for us to think we, through nothing but our own efforts, can live a life that's good enough. And second, it doesn't matter how bad other people around us might appear. We can't take comfort in saying something like, well, I know I haven't been perfect, but aren't I a whole lot better than that person over there? This is a trap the Pharisee falls into in today's passage, and it's a trap Jesus is warning us about 2,000 years later. When we become comfortable with ourselves simply because of our pious actions and our good works, trouble awaits. Simply because we're here every Sunday, simply because we serve on this committee or that committee faithfully, simply because we put some money in the offering plate every Sunday, does not make us good enough for God. But Jesus makes this point crystal clear, right here in the last part, as crystal clear as anywhere else when he says, but the tax collector standing far off would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. And what a great example this is of how the true lesson of yet another parable would be lost on those without ears to hear, because of their prejudices, because of their own faith in themselves, because they could not acknowledge anything at all good about a tax collector. And so they would miss the most important point, the most important part of the whole story, when Jesus says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. And we need to be extremely careful that our own biases and self-righteousness doesn't conceal this awesome truth of this story from us too. Because you see, what Jesus tells us is that the tax collector was not justified along with the other, along with the Pharisee. He was justified rather than the other. Well, I picture this Pharisee with his head held high, proclaiming his righteousness for all to hear and to witness and to be impressed, so sure of his exalted place in both the eyes of God and in the eyes of men. This lowly tax collector could not even lift his head for the shame and for the weight of his guilt. Because he couldn't make the same claims before God that the Pharisee made. As far as we know, the tax collector had no tithing, no fasting, no cleanness from being set apart from others. All he had was his guilt. Oh, and he had one more kind of important thing. He had faith that the almighty, all-knowing, all-loving God of the universe could have mercy on a truly repentant sinner. And he had a willingness to throw himself at the feet of this merciful God. And this alone sent him to his house justified. Do you know what it means to be justified? It means that his sins were forgiven. It means they were removed from his account as far as the east is from the west. It means that he was reconciled with God. No, it doesn't mean that he was perfect. It doesn't mean that he was free from future temptation to commit more sin. But it does mean, as John Wesley wrote, to him that is justified or forgiven, God will not condemn him on that account, either in this world or in that which is to come. His sins, all his past sins, in thought, word, and deed, shall not be remembered or mentioned against him any more than if they had not been. So this is certainly a message about the dangers of self-righteousness. It is. But it is more important, a message about salvation and about God's grace and faith, all summarized in just a few short lines of a parable. And what a message. A message that doesn't leave any ambiguity about our role in God's plan for our salvation. I don't care who you are. I don't care how long you've been a Christian. I don't care how long you've been a member of this church or any church. I don't care how many committees you've served on, or let me look in the mirror for just a second. I don't care how many sermons you've preached. The minute we lose sight of how unworthy we are of God's mercy and the justification, the total forgiveness of sins and reconciliation with God that Jesus promised. The minute we start to feel any sense of pride or satisfaction in our own personal righteousness, the minute we look at a neighbor and say, I'm glad I'm not like you, we become just like the Pharisee in this parable. And we should beware, because this is also a cautionary tale. But this is a parable of incredible hope as well. That our salvation does not lie in our own hands. And I think this is the most important thing here. That the way the tax collector approached God was with a total dependence on God. A total throwing of himself at the feet of a merciful and loving God. And nothing but faith and hope in God's mercy. And this tells me that ultimately, and listen to this please, our salvation is not in our hands. It is in God's hands. From the very beginning, when God reaches out to us through prevenient grace, making it possible for us to even consider having a relationship with God, making us aware of our sinfulness and our need for forgiveness through Christ Jesus, our hope of salvation rests fully in God's hands. And this is not to say that when we throw ourselves at the feet of God and accept God's forgiveness through faith in Christ Jesus, that we aren't expected to change, because we are. But again, it is only through God's grace and the power of the Holy Spirit that this will lead to more righteous behavior on our parts. But one of the greatest stumbling blocks for humanity has always been our relentless pursuit of self-reliance. Whether it's the promise offered by the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, or the reliance on armies and chariots and idols that we see throughout the Old Testament, humanity always seems to want to go it alone. To believe if we just work hard enough, if we're just smart enough, if we're just clever enough or rich enough, or even if we do enough good deeds, we won't have to rely on God. We won't have to follow someone else's rules, because we can do it ourselves. But the message of this parable and the message of the gospel is that God's grace, God's pursuit of us, all of us, always, always, always comes first. then all we have to do is trust in God. Accept the grace. Embrace it and count on it. In other words, have faith. And we, like that tax collector, and unlike the Pharisee, go to our homes justified. Now, wouldn't you rather rely on God than on yourself for something as important as your eternal salvation? I know that I would. And I know that we can. Amen and amen. This morning I invite you, if you're tired of trying to rely on yourself for God's favor, if you're tired of relying on yourself for fulfillment, for purpose in your life, for experiencing God's kingdom right here and now, then I invite you to listen for that small, still voice that's speaking to your heart. And if you'd like to give your life to Christ for the first time, then I invite you to come and talk with me this morning. If you'd like to join this church, our doors are open for you, and I would also like to talk with you about that if you would like to become a member of this church. As we prepare to continue to worship God by singing our closing hymn, won't you stand, please?